Right. Ladies and gentlemen, this will be ultimately a speech about the future. However, various circumstances do require me to say something about the past. The first past I shall speak about is just 7 months ago. Last June, a number of people wrote to me asking whether I had taken leave of my senses. I was a person of reasonable eminence in the world libertarian movement. I was not particularly old. I was not evidently broken down by sickness of body or of spirit. I did not even appear to have run out of things to say. All this, and yet I had changed places with one of my subordinates, a subordinate who was pushing towards 40 years younger than me. What on earth was I doing? Well, I think the answer to that question, by far the best answer to that question, is to look around you at this room. I kept the Libertarian Alliance going on life support for a number of years and did so with considerable ability, but something I could never have done was to arrange a conference like this. I could never have given the British end of the libertarian movement the clean beginning that it has been given starting from today. And so there is an answer to the question that was put to me 7 months ago.
Well, I may as well cash in while we're here.
Well, you've often complained that I'm never smiling when you photograph.
You don't move your hands enough. You need to move your hands more.
Oh, do I? No. The second past I want to discuss is the first time when I spoke at a gathering in this hotel. It was in April 1981. I was speaking not to a meeting of the Libertarian Alliance, but to a meeting of something called the Free Trade and Anti-Common Market League, which was exactly what its name would suggest. The topic of my speech was why all drugs that had ever existed, did exist, or might one day exist, should be made completely legal. I spoke to an audience of men considerably older than I am at the moment. But of course, these were good early 20th century English classical liberals. They nodded politely. They, of course, accepted the case, but they came up afterwards rather more flattering about the enthusiasm with which I had spoken than about the particular merits of the rights I had demanded, especially when they were rights that it was quite plain I had not the slightest interest in exercising for myself. And so, in this building, was born my reputation for being an outspoken and a radical libertarian. I've always been a bit of a fraud when it comes to radicalism. I am not actually that radical. And I just don't deserve the reputation that I have acquired since April 1981. Oh yes, of course, I'm a libertarian. Yes, I believe in freedom of speech. I believe in freedom of association. I believe in free markets. I believe in a great deal more of these things than the current British state does. I believe in more of these things than most people in this country appear to believe. Unless you want to play around with the definition of the word libertarian, and that would be to exclude virtually everyone in our tradition before about 1960, I am an undoubted libertarian. At the same time, I've always been a bit of a Tory as well. When I spoke here in April 1981, I put the case for legalizing drugs, so far as I can remember, on the basis of abstract right and of utility. I could, however, even then, just as easily have put my case in terms of immemorial tradition. I have no objection, and this is putting it in a rather mild negative way, I have no objection at all to the immemorial customs and traditions and institutions of England. Indeed, I've always held them in the highest possible regard. So far as any nation is a compact between those who are dead, those who are living, and those who are yet to be born, England beats just about every other nation that currently exists. It is the best country in the world, even now. Well, I mean, there's not much competition. I think you get what I mean. Now, I could have put my case for legalizing drugs in terms of an almost mystical Tory reverence for the wisdom of our ancestors. Now, that was then, this is now. I have not changed my opinions. I am still a libertarian with a strongly Tory inclination. What has changed is the world around me. 37 years ago, if I had been so inclined, I could have stood in this building and spoken about the unbroken continuity of our national life since the Middle Ages. I could have pointed out that compared with so many other peoples in the world, we had weathered the storms of the 20th century in almost miraculously good order. Oh yes, the reason I was speaking was to address a specific problem. But ultimately, I was arguing over details. We still had a constitution that the Victorians would have recognised. You could still feel, as you walked around the country, that you were part of that compact between those who are dead, those who are living, and those who are yet to be born. If nobody were to pay attention to me and my kind, and if drugs were to remain illegal, and if taxes were to remain much higher, and if we were to be regulated and nationalised in various ways, these were important, but these were details. I still lived in the best country in the world. What has happened since then is that the ties of continuity have been snapped. Those ties of continuity, which I could still look at in 1981, turned out to be rather like a piece of fruit which, outwardly still fresh, has long since been rotting from within. I didn't know it in 1981, but the next 3 decades, the next 30 years, were to be a time of rapid and alarming revolutionary change. ancient forms, ancient institutions which had come down to us in unbroken evolution from the Middle Ages were swept away as so much rubbish accumulated from the past. Or if they were not to be swept away, they were to be so entirely transformed that they ceased to be recognisable in terms of our national history. Increasingly, this may have something to do with age, I suppose, but increasingly, as often as I open a newspaper, or as often as I can bear to turn on the television, or sometimes as often as I set foot outside Deal, I feel that I am walking about a foreign country. Now, there was a time when I would have proceeded to a close examination of the changes that have taken place in the past 30 years. But really, there is no point doing that. It's not part of my brief for today to discuss these changes. And every one of you here knows at least roughly what has happened. What has happened is that Toryism has become impossible. You could, 37 years ago, be a Tory. It was difficult, I suppose, bearing in mind that it was somewhat out of fashion, but it was possible. Today, it is not possible. Toryism, traditional English Toryism, is dead. You can define this Toryism as a settled prejudice in favour of what is established, a dislike of rapid and sudden change. Well, there is nothing left to defend. If you want, there is no point fearing rapid and sudden change. We've had it now for more than a generation. If there were to be a government of traditional English Tories taking office on Monday morning, it would no more be able to put the old order of things back together than the men who found themselves in charge of France after 1815 were able to put back the Ancien regime. You cannot revive a dead man. You cannot bring back a set of customs and institutions and habits of thought that have passed away so completely that nowadays you probably need a history degree to remember, to know that they once existed. Well, that's sad for the Tories, isn't it? If you're a libertarian, you can tell yourself, oh, it's different for us. Yes, it is different if you're a libertarian. You do not argue from the specifics of your own particular society. You are used to arguing from first principles. And you may make compromises according to the specific circumstances of the country that you are trying to change, but ultimately you know where you want to go. It is simply a question of by what means you get there and how long you propose to take. And so the changes of the past 37 years are disappointing, but they're not the same catastrophe as they have been to the Conservatives. Times change. We believed in liberty in 1981. We believe in liberty in 2018. It's just that although our principles have never changed, our tactics may need to change to take account of the new circumstances. There is something in that kind of analysis, but I don't think it's entirely the truth. We have not, as libertarians, emerged entirely unscathed from the changes of the past generation or so. Back in 1974, when Margaret Thatcher took over the Conservative Party, it was possible to believe that the great majority of people in this country wanted to be free. It was simply a matter of inspiring those people with the right vision. It was a matter of persuading them out of the belief that had grown up since the 1930s about the undesirability or the unfeasibility of a much smaller state. That is what we believed. Set the people free was the cry from the Conservative Party, and many of us thought, yes, that's it. But that was in the 1970s. It is now, I think, pretty plain that the great majority of people in this country have no interest whatever in being free. Oh, I mean, they want to be free in the way that teenage children are free to change the colour of their hair or to stay in bed rather than getting up, getting dressed and going somewhere. But in terms of the right to life, liberty and property, the majority of people in this country, and I believe in most other countries, have no particular interest in being free. Indeed, in this country, they seem rather to like the police state that we have. They don't care that speech is not free. They don't care about controls on association. They don't at all mind the amount of regulation that we have in this country. They seem to have accepted the various kinds of loyalty oath that are required to work in the public and increasingly in the corporate sector, and they are quite willing to denounce each other and even hunt each other out for a breach of those loyalty oaths. If anyone comes and tells me, Sean, the people are yearning to be free, they want to strike off the shackles of politically correct socialism, I'll tell him, just go. You should just go for a walk for a few weeks. Go into pubs, go to street markets, go and see what it's like in this country, then come back with that. Because there is, as I said, no particular desire to be free in this country. Now, this makes us as a movement completely without relevance. Earlier this morning, Keir spoke about the Traditional Britain Group. The Traditional Britain Group has problems. It has to announce its it has to keep the venue of its meetings a close secret until shortly before the meetings take place. It is denounced and demonised by the establishment media. It has, on several notable occasions, been infiltrated, and alleged statements by persons in meetings of the Traditional Britain Group have been published in the media and used as an excuse for further demonisation. The MISES UK, and before it the Libertarian Alliance, we never had those problems. This meeting, for example, was publicised months ago, wasn't it? Months ago. We said where it was, when it was, how to apply to get into it. And yet when I rolled up this morning, I didn't have to pass through any pickets. No one has tried to photograph me as I came in and out of the hotel. I don't believe that I've met any agents of provocation in the audience. No one has been trying to entrap me into statements of wickedness. Why is this? It may be that the Traditional Britain Group is a bestial hate group at war with our... You could shut the door, Stefan.
Oh, sorry. Is that whiskey or something? It is.
You are excused. What was it? Ah, the Traditional Britain Group. It may be that the Traditional Britain Group is just a bestial enemy of our British values. Whereas Mises UK is a group of libertarians. You know, if you believe that, you need your head screwed on. The real reason is that the powers that be suspect that the Traditional Britain Group is trying to answer important questions, and that eventually, if those answers are given a wider audience, they will be accepted by large numbers of people. Whereas we are just libertarians. From the point of view of changing the world, we might as well have spent today discussing why the Earth is flat, or assuring each other that it is only about 6,000 years old. We are tolerated because we are irrelevant. Now, what is to be done about this? It may be, and I'm looking at somebody, it may be that nothing is to be done. We are right in the Platonic sense. We are right. We are right to emphasize the supreme importance of the non-aggression principle and the rights to life, liberty, and property. If the rest of the world disagrees with us, so much the worse for the rest of the world. We shall continue putting a radical, uncompromising case for what we believe, in the sure and certain hope that at some point in the near or distant future, enough people will agree with us to bring on a libertarian utopia. Indeed, we may be so committed to our principles that we shall find time to start denouncing and excommunicating each other for our differing emphasis on the rights to life, liberty, and property. Now that is, I suppose, a viable answer to the problem that we face, an intellectually viable answer, insofar as it will be emotionally satisfying. I don't find it a very satisfactory response to the problem that we face, because things are getting rapidly worse in England and in America. Again, let me refer to Leader Markland's speech this morning. This country has, even in the past year, moved noticeably further to the left, or whatever else you want to call it. Things have got noticeably worse in this country since the European referendum, and they appear to have got noticeably worse in the United States since the election of Donald Trump. And there is no reason to believe that things will get spontaneously any better. There was a time when you could say, oh, this Labour government is a terrible thing, but sooner or later we'll get another Conservative government, and then things will get a bit better. Well, you can't say that at the moment. You can't say it at all. For those of you who don't live here, you may not be aware, indeed I sometimes forget it, but we have had a Conservative government in this country since 2010. And it does not appear to have made any difference. Indeed, I know there are many of us who are just asking, why bother voting next time? It doesn't matter at all. And so you cannot rely on any body of electoral force to stop the drift into tyranny or the drift into oblivion. I suppose you could look to the alt-right. The problem is that Oh, of course, we have friends in the alt-right. We've often had alt-right people to our meetings. I have myself addressed various meetings that could only be defined as alt-right, and many of us can say the same. But they're not quite the same as us, and they're not quite as interested as we are in life, liberty and property. As Professor Hopper said in Bodrum last September, these people start with the same complaints, but rapidly proceed to an entirely different kind of analysis and different prescriptions. Do we really want to sit here wrapped up in ideological purity while letting the alt-right and the cultural Marxists slag it out among themselves? I don't think so. And so let me come back to this government of Tories, or this government of libertarians, which may take power on Monday, or a movement of libertarians or Tories, or libertarians and Tories, who may start preparing to take power at some point in the future. What sort of synthesis might we then expect? Let me give you 3 propositions. How much time have I spent?
I've got about 10 minutes.
I've got 10 minutes, that's plenty of time for what I want. Let's start with 3 propositions. The first proposition 1, this nation is a kind of family. It is not simply a random collection of individuals, it is something approaching to a family. Whether or not we are truly united in terms of common blood, we are united by a whole series of ties. Now, this gives us, I won't speak of rights, but I'll speak about obligations and expectations of each other, which go beyond those established by contract. We expect our young men to risk their lives in legitimate wars of national defence. Those young men have legitimate expectations of us. And so the nexus of obligations and expectations unites us as a people. The second proposition is that the wealth and the happiness and the power of our country depend very largely on a firm respect for the rights of property and of liberty. We all know our economics, so there's no point doing more than simply refer to this. We know that a country in which taxes are lower, in which regulations are lighter, in which property is more secure, will be wealthier, will be happier, and will be more powerful in the world than countries where those things are not so fortunate. The third proposition is that these 2 first propositions often conflict with each other. There is no reconciling them by a process of reasoning from first principles. There was a time when you could try to reconcile them in the light of tradition. But as I said, this body of tradition is dead, or at the best it is dormant. And so we must use our common sense to bring about a reconciliation of these 2 often conflicting propositions about our nation. I suppose common sense is in itself a kind of tradition, but I don't want to discuss that. Now, what I'm saying is that as libertarians, if we feel any obligation to try to have a positive impact on the state of affairs in this country or in our own country, we must be prepared not to change our principles, there is no reason for that whatever, but to compromise in the application of those principles. Let me give some examples of compromise in which we might need to engage. The first, I could talk about immigration, but I'm not going to. Welfare. Let's talk about welfare. When I was younger, I used to read these plans for what a libertarian government in Britain or America should do in its first 100 days. And the first thing that the right would often say is, on day one, our new government will abolish all state welfare. Well, I suppose it looked rather naughty at the time. But, it's a waste of paper and ink, and more recently of pixels. The overwhelming majority of people in Britain and America and in any other country which I have the slightest knowledge are in favour of state welfare. Indeed, every territory settled or governed by Europeans of which I have any knowledge has had some kind of welfare safety net. People like the idea that if through unavoidable misfortune they become poor, that there will be somebody to feed them. People like the idea that if they break their legs or have a heart attack, that they will not go bankrupt immediately after receiving a bill for treatment. Now, this is not in any sense to endorse the current welfare state, which is not a welfare state. It is a vast system of sinecures for cultural Marxists, for revolutionary priests, you could call them. And these are the people who should be the first victim of any cuts that our government of conservative libertarians should make. These people should be swept aside. You should strip out all of these malign bureaucracies. You should deregulate all the medical professions. You should repeal all of the laws which hamper innovation and experiment in the delivery of medical or welfare services. There should, of course, be strong encouragement for people to look in future to their own welfare and their own health. An encouragement of what used to be called friendly societies, of mutual organisations. But when all of that is done, I really see no political value in saying, let's cancel all the old age pensions and freedom is my right to sniff cocaine while stepping over a starving Alzheimer patient. There may be some intellectual consistency in that, but it is not likely to make things better in the short term. There are other compromises that we may be prepared to make, but I'll come back to where I started. We can revel in our present irrelevance. We can rejoice that we are not infiltrated, we are not blacklisted, we are not targeted by the cultural Marxists. But I don't think that our comparative immunity will last too much longer. I also think it would be a waste of the undoubted intellectual ability, the undoubted intellectual and organisational ability that many of us possess, if we did not take some part in the re-establishment of liberal civilization in this country or in our own country. And if we want to take part in that re-establishment, then I do suggest it is necessary to discuss the nature and the extent of the practical compromises that we must make. Compromises that, I emphasize, do not require intellectual compromise. It does not involve a change of fundamental principle. And I would suggest that we should try to bring about, at the very least, a tactical or a strategic compromise between Toryism and Libertarianism. And if anyone says, well, what you're suggesting does not sound particularly new, isn't it the one nation conservatism that Benjamin Disraeli and his followers preached in the 19th century? And doesn't it sound rather similar in an abstract sort of way to the promises that Donald Trump made in order to get himself elected? Promises that he appears to have broken once the election was over. There's nothing original about this, is there? And my answer is no, there isn't. But a lack of originality is no reason for ignoring a recommendation. And so with that recommendation, I will thank you for the great patience you have shown, because I am the last speaker of the day. You're all rather tired and probably in need of a drink. And so with that, I shall thank you.
Thank you very much. We haven't got the room for very much longer, but I don't think we'll be rushed out too quickly. Just quickly, I'd like to thank a few people. I'd like to thank all the speakers for really good speeches. I'd like to thank two Andrews, Andrew Linley and Andy Duncan, in particular for various backstage things that no one really noticed probably, but were enormously helpful. And to all of you for coming, and I hope you'll be able to come again to something in the future. We will quite possibly mill around the hotel for a bit, I don't know. But yes, thank you very much.